you're watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. The exchange rate for the Chinese currency renminbi or RMB against the US dollar has reached a balanced level. That's according to recent comments by the noted Chinese economist Wu Jinglan. The statement was made not long after the U.S. presidential election in which China's currency became a major political issue. The Republican candidate vowed that if elected, he would brand China a currency manipulator on his first day in office. Even though he lost, the debate about the RMB exchange rate continues. But is it really the central issue related to the Chinese economy anymore? How has China been working on its currency reform? How much impact will the issue have on the health of the Chinese economy? To answer all of those questions, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Xu Shitao, who is the chief representative of the Economist Group here in China. Welcome, sir.
Glad to be here.
Also, we're joined in the studio by Professor Dai Shanfeng. He's a adjunct professor from the School of Economics at Renmin University. Welcome as well, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
But before, gentlemen, we go to a discussion with the two of you, let's take a look at this background report.
China's yuan keeps rising. The central bank fixed the yuan's midpoint against the US dollar 10 basis points lower at 6.2918 on Thursday. As of Tuesday, the RMB had hit the upper limit 15 times out of 16 trading sessions. But concerns over the looming US fiscal cliff and the failed consensus on Greece's rescue fund are dampening the yuan's future appreciation.
The mild rebound of the greenback was due to two reasons. For one thing, investors increased their dollar positions today. For another, as no consensus was reached on Greece's rescue fund, markets were disappointed, driving down the euro and pushing up the US dollar.
Analysts say a dramatic appreciation in the Chinese currency is now unlikely. Wu Jinglan, a prominent economist, said recently that the exchange rate of the RMB against the US dollar has reached a balanced level after undergoing successful reforms and major fluctuations since 2005. The RMB had been on a path of appreciation for more than a decade. Since China launched the reform of the RMB exchange rate regime 7 years ago, the RMB has appreciated by 30% against the US dollar. Its real effective exchange rate has appreciated 29.5%. It's now been a week since China's new leaders took their seats at the Politburo Standing Committee last Thursday. Fluctuations in the foreign exchange market are keeping investors on the alert over how China's policy will shape the global economy over the next 10 years.
Xu Shitao, Dai Shanfeng, gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Very first question, your comment about the statement made by the Chinese renowned economist Wu Jinglan that the RMB exchange rate is, according to him, at a balanced level to the US dollar. Do you agree with that?
Yes or no? Well, first of all, RMB exchange indeed has seen extraordinary appreciation. So on that basis, you may say it has reached relatively equilibrium level. However, in the past 7 years, the extent in which appreciation has been achieved mainly is one way, because we haven't seen enough relaxation on China's capital account. So on that basis, we simply don't know whether that's indeed the fair value. So I think going forward, more effort should be made in facilitating China's outbound investment. I think the market will give us a more accurate answer.
Besides painting a picture for the future, what is your view, Professor Dai, whether that statement you agree with it or not?
Yes, it's debatable. Yeah, when you look at the fair value of a currency for large liquid currencies such as US dollar or euro or yen, normally people treat the market price as fair value because the market is extremely efficient. And for RMB, it's such a unique regime. It's tightly managed by the government. It's pretty hard to say which level is really the equilibrium level. The only reason people are saying it is approaching equilibrium is because during the past year, there has been some volatility in RMB exchange rate. But that volatility itself does not really say definitively about if it is in equilibrium or not.
Whether it is only volatility or rather it is volatility in one direction, which is mainly the appreciation of the RMB exchange rate vis-a-vis the US dollar, is an interesting question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you know, if it is one-way appreciation, okay, people will say confidently, it hasn't approached equilibrium yet. Okay, the only reason, you know, we begin to argue about if it is approaching equilibrium is because there has been significant depreciation pressure during the past year.
As a result of what?
As a result of a fear about China possibly going through a hard landing in the economy. Therefore, that impacts the sentiment of the currency.
There are so many different kinds of statements and views about whether the RMB exchange rate is really balanced and what exactly does balanced mean.
Right.
And of course, there are different versions coming out. One of those versions was a report published by the IMF earlier, 1 month ago rather, which was quite debated in China. Many believe it is not necessarily true what the report said. What the report said earlier was from the IMF that there is going to be, should be, modest appreciation of the RMB further. However, depreciation is expected in the short term. It, in a way, relates to what Professor Dai said earlier. But what do you think about all these different kinds of versions about where the exchange rate is and whether it's balanced or not, and the huge and enormous interest behind all of these different versions of statements?
Well, I think if you want to use lay people language to interpret what IMF is saying is, in the near term, the currency is likely to remain strong. But going forward, in the medium term, inflation in China is likely to remain at rather elevated level, which is true, everyone understands.
And therefore?
Therefore, in the medium term, we may see a mild depreciation of the currency, but if you take into account inflation differential, the currency remains strong.
All right. We've been debating about the RMB
Yeah.
exchange rate, not just today.
Yeah.
We did it weeks ago, months ago, years ago. But the central question really is, gentlemen, is it still really should be the focus of attention? I mean, so much focus of attention when it comes to the Chinese economy, when it comes to the world economy.
Well, again, yes or no, because currency
You can't
is
do that.
No,
You
well,
can
first of all,
always sit on
currency
the
is
fence.
currency. No, I'm not staying on the fence. Currency is only one tool. But the reason currency has gained so much attention in the past few years, on the one hand, reflects China's more prominent position in international arena on the economic front. On the other hand, I have to say, perhaps if currency reform could have been accelerated in the past few years, today the situation could be better.
Well, there's a lot of could have, should have, might have. Of course, those have not necessarily taken place as you expected in the statement. But then, what does it really mean?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at currency, the reason it become a hot topic is because RMB is highly political driven. If you look at the U.S. election from the past year, as election year, whenever they have election, they will pick RMB. They will think, they blame China for purposely devalue RMB. That's the way it goes. So I think it become a hot issue because it is highly political.
Right, it is political, but now we're at the end of the U.S. presidential election, and there's also a very peaceful and smooth transition of the Chinese top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore, to what extent shall we still use our energy to examine the issue of the RMB? As both of you may know, this is not just the appreciation of the RMB, but rather China is facing many challenges. At the same time, China still has some of the advantages it used to have. For example, it has a labor surplus, arguably. However, its labor cost has been rising, so it's very much a mixed picture. In all of these entangled and mixed picture, where is the RMB exchange rate? How important is it anymore?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for China now is reform. because
I guess you have reached a consensus with a lot of Chinese people on that. But then what does it have to do with the RMB exchange rate?
Exactly, and one of the major reform area would be the financial industry, or the financial market, and the RMB, fits tightly into the whole financial reform, because RMB, the currency, is such a complex issue. It has, everything to do with domestic financial market development, the comfortability of RMB, capital flow. It just impacts everything. So it is one of the most important reform area. I don't want to focus on this area, but it is very important going forward.
Is it the issue facing China, or it is one of those issues facing the health of the Chinese economy?
Well, China has a stated goal to internationalize the RMB. So in the very long run, RMB would have the comparable position as a reserve currency as the US dollar, Japanese yen, the euro, so on and so
China
forth.
didn't make that statement at all. It was said by others that China has the ambition and the potential of doing that.
Right. But China has stated her goal to internationalize
Which is?
the currency, which means to gradually relax the control in capital account, at the same time to accelerate financial liberalization domestically, for example, interest rate.
Is it really equivalent to having the RMB as the reserve currency of the world? It is
Well, that would be the
not.
consequence. That would be the consequence. It's not a goal. It's not a goal. But clearly, lack of financial liberalization, which has been trailing in the past 30 years, and that's increasingly exposing China's certain vulnerability or certain imbalance, we say. So I do believe financial sector liberalization in this area to make RMB a convertible currency, even partially convertible, will be the centerpiece of reform.
Can China afford it now? Because when we talk about reform, it is being rightly put during the 18th Party Congress, which just concluded in China. The timetable, arguably, is one of the most important things, and how to implement the blueprint is certainly one of the most important things. Therefore, what about the RMB exchange rate and overall speaking, the financial reform going on in this country?
Yeah.
Once again, I want to put that question to you, Professor Dai. We mentioned this, appreciation of RMB combined with the rising cost of Chinese labor, what it might mean for an economy in China, which is still quite much dependent on the export sector, even though that structure is being changed or is meant to be changed right now.
Yeah, if you look at the major goal for reform, we talk about it going forward, that be focused on the real economy. Like whatever reforms we talk about in the financial market, including the RMB, the purpose would be to serve the real economy. So therefore, again, when we talk about currency, you mentioned manufacturing sector, which is a key issue as well. If the RMB keep appreciating, it will have impact on the manufacturing sector, especially the lower end manufacturing sector. Coincidentally, that serve the purpose of so-called transformation of the economy. So the people have to really try hard to move up in the value chain.
That is an interesting argument. Dr. Xu, does China need to be pushed to an edge in order to do the reform, whether it's currency reform, as illustrated by Professor, or the labor reform, or the overall economic structure?
Yeah, I mean, that's, currency actually is changing all prices in a uniform manner. But of course, China still has many distortions in terms of various prices. So perhaps we can just tie to the statement made by Wu Jinglian, the noted Chinese economist. Perhaps what he has really meant was the appreciation is overdone. From that perspective, I agree, because if you really, really strive for certain reforms domestically to change relative prices, and you don't need this one-way appreciation of the currency, which has been rather passive, actually has to reflect China's I would say, lack of effort in terms of relaxing capital control in the past 7 years, and so we've been forced to accumulate our reserves, and as a consequence, domestic inflation stays at elevated level.
And your final point is?
So my final point, perhaps we can accept certain currency depreciation as political pressure are easing with U.S. election out of the way.
I see. We're going to continue our discussion about the RMB, but not necessarily just about the exchange rate, but rather the overall economy in China, possibly elsewhere in the world as well. We're going to continue our discussion, gentlemen, right after this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching a live edition of Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. Our topic today, the RMB exchange rate. Well, that is a topic for years, but still we're getting some new elements into the discussion. With us in the studio, Professor Dai Shanfeng, adjunct professor from the School of Economics with Renmin University, and also Mr. Xu Shitao, Chief Representative of the Economist Group here in China. Welcome back, gentlemen. Earlier, you two have been quite agreeing with one another in terms of which state China is of its financial reform and what does RMB exchange rate mean for the economy. Let me ask you a little bit more, because the RMB exchange rate issue is not necessarily just an economic issue when it comes to China context. It is also a how shall we say, a foreign policy issue, international relations issue, because China has been facing pressures over the past few years, if not decades, to appreciate the RMB. And yet many have been resenting that fact that the RMB exchange rate adjustment has to be catering to the outside cause, which sometimes is true to the reality, sometimes, some argue, is not necessarily. Professor Dai, how do you see that layer of the debate when it comes to the RMB exchange rate?
Yeah, that's the point I try to make. There are a lot of factors driving a currency value, but for RMB, you can strip out the complexity. The thing that's sticking out is really the trade position. Meaning the trade deficits for the U.S. and the surplus for China. That's why it becomes such a political issue, and it becomes so-called global imbalance. Not just U.S. Globally, the advanced countries, they are calling for rebalancing in the global economy. One way to do it, the way they think about it, is through RMB appreciation. Okay. It reminds me, us of back in the Japanese yen, 1987, that Plaza Accord, right? So that's global call for U.S. dollar to depreciate,
right,
to rebalance the global economy. It sounds very similar, but that's the fundamental logic.
Is it fair, though? I mean, we have already the precedents being illustrated by Professor Dai earlier about Japan back in the 1970s. Is it fair that Chinese RMB appreciate, U.S. dollar with quantitative easing, several rounds, depreciate, therefore it gets itself out of the recession, while China's economy, with exports mainly being its pillars so far, is heading into trouble?
Well, quantitative easing and currently so-called QE3 clearly is creating another wave of upward pressure for Chinese currency, and that's what I've seen in the past 20 trading sessions, and the currency has been hitting 20-year high. But in the medium term, I do think we need to look at certain fundamentals. And China is not Japan in the 87. Japan was fully developed, and China today, with only per capita GDP of $5,000 US, China is still a quite developing country. Number two, China really has still a lot of domestic issues, internal imbalances. So I do think for China, the goal is to have domestic goals are more important. So whether RMB exchange rate is going up or going down, it's a secondary.
It's a secondary to what?
To China's so-called international responsibility.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's...
Who actually outline whose responsibilities, what responsibilities are for one individual country or another? What does rhetoric, let's say,
let me put it this
from,
way. China's responsibility is to create more employment. China's responsibility is to narrow the gap between urban China and rural China. China's responsibility is not to increase aggregate demand of global economy. I mean, if China could do that as the consequence, that's fine, but that's not China's primary responsibility.
Professor?
I'm kind of stepping out of my area of expertise, talking about international politics. I think, if you talk about international politics, every country is for themselves.
That's called national interest.
Yeah, I mean, when Obama, is running for president, he said openly, I'm running for our national interest. So, so I think it's every country will try to get advantage. That's why the U.S. try to devalue U.S. dollar, and the Japanese government is actively intervening in the yen market. So the currency, it is very important financial instruments because it impacts everything. It impacts through the trade, and through the supply chain, it will impact other sectors.
Then what do you believe China's responsibilities are, as illustrated by Dr. Xu?
Yeah, I think right now the consensus is focusing on developing China's domestic demand. So we want to develop the market. That's when we look at domestic policy, when we talk, we have a dialogue with the other countries, and that's where we are focusing on. And that's where the other countries are pushing us to do, basically saying, you have to develop your domestic market to generate demand.
Well, generate demand. Some say if the RMB appreciate, then Chinese is going to be able to purchase more worldwide.
Yes. That's why China must accelerate financial sector reform, because you need to look at how the currency has been appreciated. See, the currency has been appreciated in a one-way traffic. That's why it's important for China to ease some of the pressure by opening up financial sector to increase investment universe for Chinese citizens. And that way, I don't think the currency will be appreciating that much. Then China will be in a much better position to articulate her case. But currently, unfortunately, no matter what China does, the currency seems to be cheap, which is not the case.
All right. Because both of you talk about reform, the speed of reform. Certainly, I would like to quote Mr. Li Keqiang, who is now the vice premier, but he is also being elected into the top 7-person leadership of the Chinese Communist Party recently. And he said this today during an economic conference. He said, I quote, "Reform is still the biggest bonus for China," end of quote. That certainly is very important. We're not quoting out of context, but he was trying to say further reform for China is still not only necessary, but also life-saving in a way.
Yes.
But how does this translate into what you two have been talking about, which is financial reform? Well,
see, since 1977-78, what China has been saying is opening up and reform. But Premier, Li Keqiang, what he has said was reform. He didn't mention opening up, because I think he knew, and the Chinese leader knew, external demand from rich countries is no longer unlimited, as in the past 30 years. So in the past 30 years, China's domestic issues could be transformed or could be alleviated by external demand. Not anymore. So his emphasis is really reform. I think that's a key message.
Well, your interpretation, what about you, Professor?
Yeah, I can be a little bit theoretical on this point. So basically, if you look at a longer term growth, the focus would be on the supply side. That's where the productivity as a major factor is going to contribute to longer term growth. So if you think about all these population dividend and the reform dividend we talk about, this all related to productivity, which is to boost growth. And the currency issue we talk about, in a way, related to the cyclical factor, the demand, because the current economy is driven by demand. I mean, the supply is not an issue. Whenever there's insufficient demand, the economy is going into a recession. So in a way, we're talking about two dimensions. I don't think they have no conflict between each other, but the two different issues.
Agree?
But I think at this juncture, reform has to be at a more elevated level, because to have so-called transition into a domestic-led economy, it's really is really the only choice, simply because external demand is likely to be very subdued, which is the best case scenario.
Yeah, I didn't have time to further explain. I didn't try to separate to the longer term growth, productivity, and financial reform. I didn't want to say these two different issues, because there's a linkage here. If you reform the financial sector with a focus on helping the real economy to achieve more efficiency, that boosts productivity as well.
Right.
So I don't want to say it's contradictory each other.
It is not just the economic growth, it is also the quality of the economic growth.
Yeah.
As very much rightly put by Mr. Li Keqiang. It has a lot to do with which factor, whether it is the healthy factor or rather the relatively traditional yet arguably unhealthy factor that have been playing the biggest role in terms of China's economic growth. On that point, where is the RMB exchange rate factor is, and where do you think in the next 5 years, let's say, it is heading for the debate?
Well,
very
I
briefly.
think if we are seeing more volatility of the exchange rate, that could be viewed as an important indicator of policymakers' commitment towards financial sector reform, because there's a lot of vested interest, I don't want to name them, actually just to maintain the status quo. But I think the top leaders have come to the realization trailing financial sector reform is becoming a greater drain for real economy. So if we see greater volatility, doesn't mean appreciation or depreciation, just volatility and greater relaxation of capital control, that would be very good.
So people shouldn't read too much out of those volatilities.
Exactly. So I think maybe 5% a trading ban next year, and then maybe in 3 to 5 years, and you have almost complete open capital account.
Well, let's see whether that is really the timeline. Professor Dai, very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, the volatility is not that much. It's manageable. And, it's a managed currency system. So if the government is willing to take back the control, it can. What happened in the past was, I believe, the government just relaxed a little bit, saying let market force to play a little bit.
What will happen in the future? That's what we are interested in. What will happen in the future, you think, 5 years span? Very briefly, please.
Yeah, in the future, I think the government is pushing for the opening up the capital account, which is, again, very debatable. People are arguing about that as well.
Okay, we are running out of time. We hope there will be more time next time when we're talking about the RMB exchange rate, because it is a topic actually related to so many areas when it comes to China's economy. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Xu Sitao and also Dai Shanfeng, thank you. And thank you for being with us. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Thank you. The Chinese renowned economist Wu Junlian that the RMB exchange rate is, according to him, at a balanced level to the US dollar. Do you agree with that?
Yes or no? Well, first of all, RMB exchange indeed has seen extraordinary appreciation. So on that basis, you may say it has reached relatively equilibrium level. However, in the past 7 years, the extent in which appreciation has been achieved mainly is one way, because we haven't seen enough relaxation on China's capital account. So on that basis, we simply don't know whether that's indeed the fair value. So I think going forward, more effort should be made in facilitating China's outbound investment. I think the market will give us a more accurate answer.
Besides painting a picture for the future, what is your view, Professor Dai?
Driving down the euro and pushing up the US dollar.
Analysts say a dramatic appreciation in the Chinese currency is now unlikely. Lian, a prominent economist, said recently that the exchange rate of the RMB against the US dollar has reached a balanced level after undergoing successful reforms and major fluctuations since 2005. The RMB had been on a path of appreciation for more than a decade. Since China launched the reform of the RMB exchange rate regime 7 years ago, the RMB has appreciated by 30% against the US dollar. Its real effective exchange rate has appreciated 29.5%. It's now been a week since China's new leaders took their seats at the Politburo Standing Committee last Thursday. Fluctuations in the foreign exchange market are keeping investors on the alert over how China's policy will shape the global economy over the next 10 years.
Xu Sitao, Dai Shenfeng, gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Very first question, your comment about the statement made by Hello, you're watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. The exchange rate for the Chinese currency renminbi or RMB against the US dollar has reached a balanced level. That's according to recent comments by the noted Chinese economist Wu Jinglan. The statement was made not long after the US presidential election in which China's currency became a major political issue. The Republican candidate vowed that if elected, he would brand China a currency manipulator on his first day in office. Even though he lost, the debate about the RMB exchange rate continues. But is it really the central issue related to the Chinese economy anymore? How has China been working on its currency reform? How much impact will the issue have on the health of the Chinese economy? To answer all of those questions, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Xu Sitao, who is the chief representative of the Economist Group here in China. Welcome, sir.
Glad to be here.
Also, we're joined in the studio by Professor Dai Shenfeng. He's the adjunct professor from the School of Economics at Renmin University. Welcome as well, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
But before, gentlemen, we go to a discussion with the two of you. Let's take a look at this background report.
China's yuan keeps rising. The central bank fixed the yuan's midpoint against the US dollar 10 basis points lower at 6.2918 on Thursday. As of Tuesday, the RMB had hit the upper limit 15 times out of 16 trading sessions. But concerns over the looming US fiscal cliff and the failed consensus on Greece's rescue fund are dampening the yuan's future appreciation.
The mild rebound of the greenback was due to two reasons. For one thing, investors increased their dollar positions today. For another, as no consensus was reached on Greece's rescue fund, markets were disappointed.
Whether that statement, you agree with it or not?
Yes, it's debatable. Yeah, when you look at the fair value of a currency for large liquid currencies such as US dollar or euro or yen, normally people treat the market price as fair value because the market is extremely efficient. And for RMB, it's such a unique regime. It's tightly managed by the government. It's pretty hard to say which level is really the equilibrium level. The only reason people are saying it is approaching equilibrium is because during the past year, there has been some volatility in RMB exchange rate. But that volatility itself does not really say definitively about if it is in equilibrium or not.
Whether it is only volatility or rather it is volatility in one direction, which is mainly the appreciation of the RMB exchange rate vis-a-vis the US dollar, is an interesting